fellas, quite a lot has been going on in MMA these past couple of days. Dan Hooker versus Justin Gaethje has now been cancelled. There's been a bunch of fight announcements that we're going to get into. UFC Qatar has a fight card coming up at May 17th. There's also been some rumoured fights between some champions in the UFC. And we're going to start off with this whole Dan Hooker versus Justin Gaethje situation. So obviously, at UFC 313, Dan Hooker was supposed to take on Justin Gaethje. And this was a fight that we're all looking forward to. It was supposed to be this back and forth scrap, an extremely fun fight where no one's leaving. Well, both of them are going to leave on a stretcher. And it was a fight that most people were looking forward to for UFC 313. You can't go wrong with this matchup. It's an uncrowned BMF fight. And this was what we're looking forward to at UFC 313. Well, this has just been cancelled because Dan Hooker has a hand injury. So that fight is no longer going to be taking place. The UFC don't know if they're going to need a replacement for Justin Gaethje or if Dan Hooker is going to be good enough to fight in like a month so they can reschedule the fight. But it just had to be Gaethje versus Hooker. Of all the fights that could have cancelled, it had to be one of the best fights that we had coming up in 2025 on a card that kind of needed a fight like this, which is disappointing. And these are my replacement options. Assuming that the UFC need a replacement for Gaethje on 2 weeks' notice, these are some of the options I've got. Number one, the replacement I would do, first and foremost, is Yoel Alvarez. I think Yoel Alvarez is the best replacement that the UFC can bring in for Dan Hooker. And by the way, we're talking about realistic replacements. Obviously, they could bring in Max Holloway or Dustin Poirier, but that's not realistic because they're at the top. I'm talking about realistic replacements, and I think Yoel Alvarez is the best. Yoel Alvarez is 22-3. Every single one of those wins that he has is by way of finish, and I think he's the best unranked lightweight in the world. I actually think he should be ranked above Benoit Saint Denis and maybe above Grant Dawson as well. So he's the best unranked 155er, and he fits the criteria of a fun fighter. The whole point of Gaethje versus Hooker is that we were going to see this back and forth scrap between two fun fighters, and this is exactly what Yoel Alvarez brings. He's one of the most dangerous fighters in the UFC. He's coming off two early knockout wins. He's also got amazing submissions as well, and I feel like Yoel Alvarez is the perfect fighter. He's fun yet dangerous, which is exactly what Dan Hooker was. He could also win or lose to Gaethje. I'd probably pick Gaethje to beat Yoel Alvarez, especially with it being on short notice, but considering how well-rounded and dangerous Yoel Alvarez is, you've got to, keep hoping him as well. His only loss recently was to Arman Tsarukyan a few years ago back in 2021, and that's Tsarukyan, and apart from that, he's been on a tear. So I think Yoel Alvarez is the number one guy that the UFC should bring in to replace Dan Hooker against Justin Gaethje. I think Yoel Alvarez would 100% take up the call. My number two option, if they don't want to do Yoel Alvarez, is Rafael Fiziev. I think Rafael Fiziev is also an equally as good option. We've seen this fight before between Rafael Fiziev and Justin Gaethje, and we know it didn't disappoint. It's not like we have to guess if it's going to be a good fight. We saw this fight before at UFC 286. It was an amazing fight. It was a back and forth fight between the two of them. Rafael Fiziev did really well. Gaethje did really well. There were a few MMA fans arguing that it was a bit of a robbery. I disagree with that, but either way, Fiziev versus Gaethje could be good. Fiziev's even said on his Twitter that he's ready to fight at UFC 313, so we know that he's in. I don't know why Gaethje wouldn't be in if it's on short notice. So Rafael Fiziev versus Justin Gaethje, it would be a fun fight, and we know that because we've seen it before. It's also a great comeback for both. What better comeback for Rafael Fiziev after an injury than a co-main event against Justin Gaethje? And what better comeback for Justin Gaethje after just being knocked out cold by Max Holloway than a guy that you fought before in a very close fight, and you're both coming back? I think Fiziev versus Gaethje part 2 would be a more than good enough replacement for Gaethje versus Hooker. My third replacement option would be Arman Tsarukyan. Now, I know I said before about it being realistic, and Tsarukyan's a top lightweight, so they might not bring him in. But realistically, Arman Tsarukyan obviously was supposed to fight Islam Makhachev at UFC 311, so people might be looking at him as a title contender. But the UFC and Dana White did say that they're not going to give Tsarukyan an immediate title fight, and it could be next year till he's fighting for a belt. Well, I think this is the perfect opportunity because Arman has a chance to redeem himself. If Arman Tsarukyan goes out there and picks up a win over Justin Gaethje on short notice, on 2 weeks' notice, then Tsarukyan's done the UFC a massive favour, and he's back in the winning column. Well, he's already in the winning column, but he's got another win against Justin Gaethje, a top contender. And I think from there, he could have earned himself a title shot. It's two top contenders going at it, so he's not like we're bringing some unranked guy or someone who's not deserved it. It's a very winnable fight for both. I know Tsarukyan will be the heavy favourite in this fight, but considering the fact that it's on short notice, Tsarukyan, and the fact that he hasn't really had a full training camp and Gaethje has, it could be winnable with Justin Gaethje. The only issue is, again, would Tsarukyan be the most trustable and reliable guy? I think if we give him another chance, he'd take this fight if we promise him a title shot. And so the other problem is it's not a guaranteed fun fight, because there's a chance that Tsarukyan could kind of turn it into a slugfest and just out-wrestle Justin Gaethje with not much going on. But I think this could be a good replacement option. And then at number 4, some other options that I think you could bring him. Number 1, Gene Silva. We've seen Gene Silva fight on 2 weeks' notice before in a different division against Drew Dober, and he finished him. He's just finished Who did he finish? He just finished MetzMusic at UFC, the recent UFC event at Seattle. If he was to go out there and beat Justin Gaethje, or even compete with Justin Gaethje 2 weeks later, this would be a banger of a fight. And if he was to beat Gaethje as well on short notice, he would turn into a superstar overnight. So I feel like Gene Silver could be one of the best replacement options you could do for the UFC. He's a star in the making. You could also do Jalin Turner. Jalin Turner's going to be fighting on this card, so he's already going to be prepared for this fight. He's going to be fighting in the featured fight. If you just move Jalin Turner up one slot and do Gaethje versus Turner, and then bring in a replacement for Bahamondes, I think that could work as well. Turner versus Gaethje is a fun fight. I think that would be really fun. So you could also do Jalin Turner, considering he's on the card and he's a ranked 155er. I also think Mateusz Gamrot could be an option. Gamrot's tweeted saying he's ready to fight Justin Gaethje, and he's been tweeting it multiple times now, so he seems like he's ready to fight Gaethje. There is a risk, though, that Gamrot, being the fighter that he is, he could go out there and make a bit of a boring fight, considering his track record. I know he had a really fun fight with Dan Hooker and a close fight with Dan Hooker, so he's kind of like a close representative as Hooker, but again, he could just out-wrestle Gaethje and make it a boring fight when we were expecting and we were promised a BMF fight. So those are some other options I think you could do for Justin Gaethje. Now, if they are going to reschedule it, I guess that kind of works because you could put it on 315, but my only issue is, if it's going to be rescheduled, who's the replacement going to be? Because it's hard to think of a fight better than Gaethje versus Hooker. What fight are you possibly going to present on 2 weeks' notice for UFC 313, which, let's be honest, needs a good fight? That could top Gaethje versus Hooker. That's my only issue. So I think Gaethje versus Hooker, being the fact that he is and how good it is, I think we should find a replacement for Gaethje. And then if Gaethje loses, maybe then you reschedule him against Dan Hooker. But I think this fight might have to go in the bin for now, and we might have to find a replacement for Justin Gaethje, unless they can find a better and bigger fight to put on UFC 313. But anyway, on to UFC Qatar. The UFC have announced a Qatar event for May 17th. Now, we haven't got a main event or anything like that, but we have got Hamdi Abdel Wahab taking on Mohammed Usman. If you don't know who these guys are, Mohammed Usman is the brother of Kamaru Usman, and Hamdi Abdel Wahab just got a robbery win in the UFC at Saudi Arabia. We've also got Jung Young Park versus Ismail Nordiev. Nordiev won against Bruno Silva at UFC Abu Dhabi, and Jung Young Park just lost to Bradford Tavares. So those are the first two fights, but we haven't got any proper fights yet. So who could possibly headline this card? I've got a few fighters that I think could possibly headline this card at UFC Qatar. And I expect this to be like a UFC Abu Dhabi / Saudi Arabia type pay-per-view where they kind of stack it in Qatar. Now, the first one is Umar Nurmagomedov. Now, I don't know who he's going to be taking on. I couldn't possibly think because a lot of the bantamweights are booked or are going to be booked. But I think Umar could definitely headline this card. He just lost to Marab in January. It makes sense from a time scale. You know, it's after Ramadan. It's on May 17th. It gives Umar enough time to get back in training camp and find an opponent in the bantamweight division. So I think Umar Nurmagomedov, because he's not a title challenger, but he is still a top fighter in the UFC, I think he could definitely headline this fight now card. He did it before with Sandhagen. Maybe he would do it against like a PTN or, I don't know, maybe even a Sean O'Malley or a Song Yadong. I also think Nassim Imavov versus Caio Browler could also headline this card. Imavov's won his last two fights, and his most recent fight was a main event in Saudi Arabia against Israel Adesanya. And this is kind of like the #1 contender fight in the middleweight division to make. Obviously, both of these guys are in that contendership. Chimaev's fighting Dricus for the belt, and you've got to assume that the winner of this fight is going to be fighting next for the title shot. And I think what better way to put a #1 contender fight like this than on a stacked Qatar card. So I think that could be another option. Now, some other fight announcements that we've got a Jasmine Judavicius versus Jessica Andrade for UFC Canada, which I think makes a lot of sense. Guram Kutateladze is going to be taking on Caio Fernandez at UFC London. I don't know why they keep adding fights to UFC London. It's already stacked. I'm not going to complain though. Now, some bigger and better fight announcements. Lerone Murphy versus Josh Emmett. Now, this isn't really an announcement. This has been announced for quite some time, but they're going to be taking each other in a Vegas fight night. Now, I love this fight. Lerone Murphy called out Josh Emmett after his most recent win, and Lerone Murphy's going under the radar in the featherweight division. He's honestly very well-rounded, very skilled guy, and he called out Josh Emmett against, well, now Josh Emmett's returning since December of 2023, the most dangerous featherweight in the world. I love this fight. My only issue is I wish it was in front of a crowd. I feel like you're putting this fight to waste because it's going to be an absolute, like, it's going to be a barn burner or it's going to be a brutal knockout by Josh Emmett, and I feel like putting it in Vegas was a bit of a waste, but I'm excited to see Josh Emmett back. I'm excited to see the step up for Lerone Murphy. I think that's a really good fight that they've done. And another fight announcement that we've had today is Jose Aldo versus Ayman Zahabi. Now, this has been announced for UFC Canada. I like this fight. I know I had a lot of problems with Aldo fighting up-and-comers when he fought Batista and what was his name? Jonathan Martinez. So it seems like the UFC just keep giving Aldo up-and-comers, but it makes sense. UFC 315 needs some fights. Zahabi's a Canadian. He's getting an opportunity against a legend in Jose Aldo. I kind of like this fight, even though I would like to see Aldo get some more favorable matchups. So that's a new fight that's been announced for UFC 315. My early predictions for that fight: he's going to beat Aldo by decision. I think he should have beat Mario Batista. He beat Jonathan Martinez, and Zahabi is probably one of the worst, or not one of the worst, but one of the most undeserving ranked fighters in the UFC. But I get why they've done the fight. They're trying to build Ayman Zahabi in Canada against a big name. So that's another fight announcement now. We've also had some rumoured fights between Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili #2, and Pantoja versus Kai France. Now, the real issue with these fights, it isn't even the fights themselves, but it's mainly the divisions, and it's that bantamweight has no #1 contender, and flyweight also has no #1 contender. There isn't a #1 contender in the bantamweight division. Maybe you've got Peter Yan because he's on a 2-fight winning streak, but he's already been dominated by Merab before. He also lost to O'Malley and Sterling. And then in the flyweight division, you've got maybe Kai France, but he's lost 2 of his last 3 fights. Neither of these divisions have a #1 contender. So what you need to do is Merab Dvalishvili versus Pantoja. This is the fight that needs to happen. Pantoja, out of all the champions in the UFC right now, is more deserving of moving up a weight class than anybody else. He has cleared out his division. Let him take on Merab for a bit of a super fight. And I think he's definitely deserved that. I think he's more than deserved that fight with Merab. And I think that could be a big fight that you do. While in the meantime, in the bantamweight division, you do Peter Yan versus Sean O'Malley 2. Both of these guys, in my opinion, are a win away from a title shot. Peter Yan's right up there. O'Malley's a former champion. He's right up there too. So I think you do a rematch between the two of them. We've seen this fight before. It was an amazing fight. It makes sense to do it again. And then also in the flyweight division, you do Manel Kape, or whoever wins this weekend between Manel Kape and Azor Mabayev, against Kai France to fully solidify yourself a top contender in the flyweight division. So when Pantoja comes back down to the flyweight division, he's got a top contender. I feel like I feel like there's been no better time to do a champion versus champion fight now between Merab and Pantoja, considering that there's no one else in their own divisions for them. So let their contenders fight, and in the meantime, do Pantoja versus Merab. And it shouldn't be O'Malley fighting Merab, because what has he done? He's sat out and done nothing, and now he's getting a free title shot. If anyone's getting a title shot in the bantamweight division, it should be Peter Yan, or the winner of Sandhagen and Figge, whenever that fight's taking place. But either way, those are that's just me discussing some of the topics in MMA recently between this Dan Hooker Gaethje situation, a couple of the fight announcements. Let me know your thoughts on this kind of style of video. But yeah, that was my thoughts on a couple of things going on recently. Thank you for watching.